Damian, thanks very much for the chance to be here.
My pleasure, Joe.
Could you begin introducing yourself?
Sure. So my name is Damian Bebell. I am an assistant research professor at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. And I am a 25-year resident of Sedgwick, Maine, where we live in this old house.
And your work around education research, technology's role in schools, takes you not only across Maine, across the United States, internationally?
Yeah, so since the late 90s and really the beginning of the 2000s, I have been designing and conducting studies trying to help schools, states, governments understand the impact and measurable, researchable impacts of educational technology investments, and typically K-12 settings. So you're absolutely right. My research has gone from Boston public schools to, schools in India, all over the world.
If we go back 2000, 2001, the ideas being floated around the MLTI, the original MLTI. 2002, the exploration schools began. As a researcher, and you were living here in Maine at the time, you saw it coming. But before that, other one-to-ones, I mean, sometimes we can think that the MLTI was the beginning of the idea of one-to-one. Yeah. Others before? Sure.
There were other one-to-one programs, but I think it's important to realize how unique Maine was because it was a statewide universal program that was affecting all students in public education. Prior programs predate Maine by at least 10 years in Australia, but typically they were at the school level, or a collection of schools, or they were serving a very specific student need. So it was a technical high school that had a one-to-one program. Maine represented a different level of sort of social responsibility and investment, in that it was a top-down, statewide program where equity was, I think you had mentioned in a prior conversation, there was no formula. Every student, every 7th and 8th grade student would have this resource. And that was really, it wasn't just a change in the access to hardware, it was a change in the philosophy and the underlying support of schools. And so where Maine was influential in pushing up access to devices and hardware resources for students and teachers, I think a bigger impact was showing that a state could take a leadership role in providing that level of resource and that level of vision across such a broad domain, across, 200, how many schools was
240
it? Yeah.
In those initial, yeah.
And so there was nothing at that scale or level anywhere in the world at that point in time. And so it was not just that access, it was the impact of recognizing that it could actually happen and be done.
With that breadth, and here in Maine, there was clearly a responsibility to judge the efficacy, to do some research, some evaluation of the project. As a researcher living here in Maine, were you part of? Did you have an opportunity to participate? Yeah,
so it's a great question. And, we originally, I have a role at Boston College, but I live in Maine. So my research is all over the world. And I live in Maine because I love Maine and I've always wanted to live in Maine. And so being a resident and kind of witnessing in my community this program was really exciting. And I was actually, fairly early in my career and beginning to develop these studies and beginning to do this research. And so I reached out very quickly to, Seymour Papert, Betty Manchester, and Angus King. And I still have the email I had sent, basically introducing myself and saying, I'm a researcher, I'm located in Boston officially, but I'm, my feet are in Maine, and I'm just passionate about telling the story. What an amazing, your focus is on helping kids in schools, but I'm seeing this as, a first in the world program that could actually shine a light for 1.4 billion other kids in the world. And they wrote me back, believe it or not, which is the funny thing, And I got invited to some meetings, and, I got to sit in. And research and evaluation did become an important component of the program right from the beginning. Now, I had other professional responsibilities, and I think for a lot of reasons that are correct, the University of Southern Maine ended up conducting a number of evaluation studies that were both internally funded and received external funds. And they really provided a series of reports and this formative toolkit and best practices for this new emerging idea in practice. And so we, worked on, sharing those results at conferences and publications. And, the research world at that time, looking at one-to-one, was pretty small. And so we were looking at, what kinds of questions were being asked, what were they finding, could we replicate that in other places? And so, Maine had a big impact in terms of the research that was shared and conducted, and was actually still being used to justify other state programs, other local programs, and just scholarship in general.
So that research from those earliest days, and May now, we're talking about almost 20 years ago, certainly 20 years from the beginning, the bubbling up of the thinking and the codification of the design. Is it still, in your work, is Maine still relevant? Do people still, is there an awareness of what went on here?
I think so, and one memory I have, and I wish I had the date, but it was a educational technology conference, probably around 2005, 2006, and Betty Manchester was one of the speakers, and just the fact that she was coming from Maine, she wasn't like a traditional academic, she hadn't been a professor and publishing research for 10 years. Her background was as a teacher and as a school leader, and now as the leader of this, innovative state program. And she gave a presentation that basically, I think half the audience was like, how do we move to Maine? It showed what school and what looked like. It showed the support mechanisms of the program. And so from the very beginning, I think, it put Maine on the map for researchers, and as this, first in the world place. And to this day, I believe it's still widely cited, and I think probably more so than it was 15 years ago. Basically with COVID and, shutting down the campuses of schools, one-to-one computing did become the mainstream in all other 49 states, Jim. It just took 20 years in an international pandemic for that to occur. To become that.
Do you remember where that conference was?
It was at Penn State. On the at their Penn State, Pennsylvania campus, and I had given a session talking about a school-wide program, and the things that we were seeing were, kids were more willing to write longer. Okay. They were more engaged. There were more opportunities to study things that they cared about or were interesting. If you were in a rural place with limited resources, the kinds of projects you could engage in were equally as limited. And so, what this program did in every place, one-to-one computing basically was this magic ratio that moved out of that, the labs and the shared technology that then allowed, these increased opportunities for learning. And we saw that in my research, and, 5 schools participated in Massachusetts one-to-one statewide pilot. I think there was 5 middle schools in New Hampshire's one-to-one pilot. Everyone in Maine participated, and the pilot is still happening. It's still evolving. It's
the exploration continues.
Yeah.
In your research, as you look, and not just in those early days of MLTI, but as you look, I find myself thinking that one-to-one, and certainly during the pandemic, an understandable rush to put devices, to be sure devices and access, that the technical components of a one-to-one were in place. Does research show that there's a balance between a need for a technical efficacy and network and a human efficacy and network? Is that backed by research?
Yeah, I think so, and it's just backed by practice, I think too, and that the devices are inanimate. They're agnostic. They serve. They can come down on parachutes, land on kids' desks, or land in their home, learning environment if we don't have access to classrooms. But essentially, they amplify or serve to amplify whatever teaching and learning modalities or practices are espoused by the teacher and accepted in that school culture. And so we work in some settings where one-to-one is just a quicker way to do test prep. It's just a quicker way to get feedback on an assessment. And then we work in other settings where it's exactly the opposite. It's meant to push out and beyond and get kids to working, more creatively and on projects and collaboratively. And so, more real world based types of activities and learning. So, the devices themselves, one-to-one is interesting because, it's a statistician's, it's a psychometrician's kind of definition. And
it's a number.
It's a ratio.
To one.
So, and it was valuable for a long time because, when I was in school in the 80s, the ratio was 125 to 1.
Sure.
And we can infer what teaching and learning looks like when you're sharing a device across 125 other kids. You get, a few hours a semester maybe at best. And so when we think of one-to-one, it carries with it kind of this connotation of more opportunity and deeper learning. But I think that's because, Maine from the beginning didn't make it about the devices. It's not called the Maine, laptop initiative. It was the learning initiative, as I understand, right, Jim?
It was Maine Learning Technology Initiative.
It was really about what the tool could facilitate. And it wasn't just about the device, it was about the professional learning for teachers. It was about building the culture. It was about providing those supports. It was about having evaluations so we can be reflective and make course corrections as we're doing this program. And so, I think it has set the stage very early on that if you're serious about implementing technological-based reform with kids in schools, that you can't just focus on the device and the technology. It has to be a bigger picture. And I think we were very lucky in Maine that there was that recognition early on.
The leadership from both Angus, Betty, et cetera, and all the way down to the classroom.
And having Seymour Papert is a local resource, right?
Not far from where we sit today.
We're very lucky. In fact, he loved hanging out in this room when we got to work together.
You mentioned that it's about learning, and you'll remember that Seymour, quite seriously, which everything he would put forward seriously. He suggested that Maine should change its nickname from Vacation Land to the Learning State. He wanted the Learning State put on the license plates.
Yeah, I one of thousands of insights from Seymour Papert that we'll never have time to properly follow up on and implement. But MLTI was one that was,
right.
And that story is so, almost like a fairy tale in a sense that, from my understanding, and, some of this is folklore now, Jim, and may not belong in a historic, an official history of MLTI, but this idea that essentially one of the earliest promoters and thinkers around technology and education, the first person to develop and implement a program language for children, essentially retires from, one of the most celebrated careers in academia, the IBM professor at MIT, founded two long-standing, well-respected research departments, moves to Blue Hill, Maine, and a summer place in Deer Isle to sail, and within, years or months, gets a call from the governor with, the promise of a big idea. And to be able to, have someone with the policy power and someone with the imagination and competency and, an entire career of knowing how to, push the envelope, sit down together is so rare. And, I feel like we're still benefiting in this state from those kinds of meetings and the kinds of teams and the kinds of plans they put forward. So, yes to Angus, yes to Seymour, but then everyone else that they were able to bring in, the 9 schools.
Right.
At
the very start.
Just all of the development work.
Well, in Betty's decision, one thing I remember, there was a push to describe them as pilot schools because that's how you talk about things like that. And Betty, I remember in a conversation, and who broached the idea that piloting can have a sense of, we put a pilot on a boat coming into the harbor because they know where the rocks are. So that there could be a sense with a pilot school that its job is to follow a prescribed course. And there was a sense, well, what if we call them exploration schools?
That's right.
And in fact, ask that of them. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah. So, for me, that was almost, again, it had this fairy tale aspect of, really, fascinating, interesting characters coming together with major ideas to change the world and change where we live. And figured out how to do it.
Those two pieces and have the ability to make it happen that change the place we live, and that was always the focus. But now your knowledge of places around the world, it changed the world. So the MLTI, the original MLTI, was an innovation of the first order. The ground moved, is the way I put it, for schools, communities across the state. Some other innovation will come forward. Innovations and the focus coming out of the pandemic on innovation. The vaccines we're benefiting from have been innovations that have moved the world. But some other innovation of this degree will come to education. From your perspective, what advice, if we were to project forward, might you give when that next innovation shows up?
Yeah, it's interesting. And, thinking of our context and being in this old house that has seen all kinds of innovation and has seen, basically history unfold in different countries, in different places. And we have such a rich state, such a rich history and educational history. As a researcher, I'm very biased in thinking about reflection and asking good questions. And I think with MLTI, there was a lot of resistance. We can look back and high five each other and think about what a far reaching idea that was. But I remember in places like Sedgwick, Maine, where, why do we need to give kids these resources? What if we put this money into other infrastructure for schools? And I think, what was helpful is having questions, having the evaluation, having teachers come together, having students come together and question and reflect on what's working and why this is, the way we want things to be, is really powerful. And so I think as new innovations come down the pike, we can look at them as critically as we looked at MLTI and learn from what worked here and know that, by getting student voice and teacher voice and parent voice, that we will make a more effective educational system that can, take whatever innovation comes, from wherever in the world it's going to emerge from, and make it work here for us.
Yeah.
And I think MLTI, over many years and decades now, managed to do that, such that this promise of local schools that serve a local area that still have this overarching umbrella of resources from the state and the feds is really powerful in Maine. And I'd like to see innovation continue, but with thoughtful questions and with thoughtful reflection. And so we can take what's good and learn what's going to serve us toward our mission and our goals here for another 200 or 300 years.
Interesting way as we think about education, you ask us to focus on the questions. The answers will come, but first focus on the questions.
We've got to get the questions right. If we agree on the questions, we'll know how to get the answers.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for this conversation.
My pleasure. Keep up the great work, Jim. Thank you.
All right.